Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the book launch Seznec, which has been convened on the occasion of, in the wake of the Arab Spring, conflict and cooperation in the Middle East. The book is based on the work of an international expert group, which met twice in Oslo, once in Ras Al Khaimah, one of the Arab Emirates. In Oslo, we had experts from the four biggest countries in the Middle East, from Turkey, from Iran, from Saudi Arabia, and from Egypt. And in Ras Al Khaimah, we also had participants from Iraq and Bahrain, and from four external powers with strong interests in the region: United States, the European Union, in this case Germany, Russia, and China. In the course of these meetings, discussions, a series of papers were produced, and the book presents an edited, revised selection of them. It has national contributions from the four countries I mentioned, from Turkey, Mustafa Kibaroglu, from Iran, Kayhan Barzegar, here present, and Sverre Lodgaard, from Saudi Arabia, Jamal Khashoggi, Mohammed al-Salafi, and from Egypt, Nabil Fahmy, who was dean at the American University at the time of writing. He is now the foreign minister of the Indian government in Egypt, and Anissa Hassouna. Also, we have two comments from external quote-unquote participants, one on the Turkish contribution by the Chinese expert on the Middle East, Wu Bingbing, and one by Jean-Francois Seznec, who name of notwithstanding is an American citizen. A comment on the contribution from Jamal Khashoggi of Saudi Arabia. Then there are separate chapters on the driving forces of the Arab Spring and the role of oil, Øystein Noreng. I have myself written an account of 10 years of talks between Iran and the big powers over the Iranian nuclear program. And then we were sorely missing a background on Syria. And that has been written by Frida Nome, who is also here somewhere. An analysis of the role of Islam as a legitimizing factor in the uprising, and for that matter for Assad as well. The project started as a NUPI project, but it was soon combined with a closely related project at the Norwegian Business School, led by Øystein Noreng, who is here. And Øystein and I, we have collaborated closely on this project, and I think it's fair to say we achieved significantly more by working together than we first envisaged. The Middle East is unique in its complexity. Politics flow from the special role of political Islam and from sectarian differences. It flows from the oil dimension, from modernity versus traditionalism, from pan-Arabism versus national orientation. And all of this on top of the more familiar universal factors, such as political history, culture, social structure, ethnicity, occupational interests. So all of this makes the Middle East more complex than anything else anywhere in the world. But at the interstate level, two cross-cutting dimensions, I submit, are fundamentally important. First, the axis of defiance or resistance versus the axis of moderation, defiance or resistance against the US and Israeli dominance and policies. Axis of moderation, well illustrated by Mubarak's Egypt by Saudi Arabia, by Jordan, by both of these dimensions are amply illustrated today in Syria, where the Iranian-led resistance is up against Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries using sectarian rhetoric to advance their interests. When we started this work, we put much emphasis on regional solutions to regional problems and to the possibilities for the states in the region, states in the Middle East, to regain their own region after decades and decades of foreign dominance. We noted that the United States is lowering its profile in the Middle East, has withdrawn from Iraq, will be out from Afghanistan next year. We're in the back seat, during much of the bombing of Libya. Obama has been holding back on arms deliveries to the opposition in Syria, then got messed up, as we know, but has been sort of rescued by Russian-American cooperation on Syria. United States strategy under Obama has clearly been to move political attention and military resources not only from Europe but also from the Middle East and on to Asia, where the main challenger is located, that is to say, China. Furthermore, we noted that the world today is such that countries also in the Middle East can relate to more than one big power in the global environment. Not only the United States, but also to the others that I mentioned. And by spreading their dependencies on the outside world, on many actors, many big powers, they can have greater sort of elbow room for their own policies, to follow up on their own interests. This belongs to the ABC of foreign policy of any country. So much like the Arab Spring, where one of the slogans was, we may now regain our own countries. We thought that possibilities were opening up for the states in the Middle East to regain their own region. That today appears a bleak prospect, and the book has many clouds on its front page, but there are also some spots of blue, which I would like to come back to. David Fromkin, in his classical book about the restructuring of the Middle East after World War I and after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, at the hands of restructuring at the hands of the British and the French. He called his book A Peace to End All Peace, a telling title, a foreboding of things to come. However, the borders that were drawn at that time, by and large, remain the same. Very few changes. Attempts have been made to change them by force, yet the borders remain, except for the enlargement of Israeli territory. One national problem was left by the wayside after World War I, the Kurdish nation, the Kurdish problem. And the Kurds, they number 20-25 million altogether. 6-7 million of them living in northern Iraq. They have already a long time ago obtained autonomy in northern Iraq. And many authors in this book reflect on the prospects for the Kurds to establish their own state. And I think it is Jean-Francois who says in his contribution that the stars are better positioned today with a view to Kurdish independence than maybe at any time before. The obstacles are also noted. Big powers. Arab Spring divided the Middle East into three categories. First, in some countries, the Arab Spring was full blown, starting in Tunisia, then moving on to Egypt, and there were footprints also in Yemen and in Bahrain. Secondly, there are those countries which shielded themselves effectively from the Arab Spring: Saudi Arabia and the smaller Emirates. And finally, a few countries opted for constitutional reform: Morocco, Jordan. You may ask, why was Saudi Arabia able to shield itself from the impact of the Arab Spring? Well, first of all, they were not quite comfortable with what happened from 2011 onwards. On their toes in relation to Yemen, even more so in relation to Bahrain, where they intervened by military force to avoid the spillover of Shia activities onto their own country, to the northeast of Saudi Arabia, where there is a Shia minority and where there is also much oil. But Jean-Francois Khashoggi, in his contribution, observes that the regime in Riyadh has had a straight contract with its people. They never promised democracy, but promised stability and welfare. And what happened when the Arab Spring started was that money was handed out to the population. The rich, oil-rich Saudi Arabia could do that, and smaller Emirates did the same, with a view to sort of pacifying the population, keeping things within bounds. And that obviously succeeded. Then came the counter-revolution in Egypt, which highlighted the role of the military in the Middle East. The military of the Middle East controls, say, 1/3 of the Egyptian economy. This is a very approximate figure. They have privileges to defend, and they're also in charge these days, politically. So the economic sphere and the political sphere, those spheres are interwoven, and that amounts to a veritable invitation to corruption and bad economic management. Iran, in a sense similar. The Revolutionary Guard has its economic interests. Again, it's hard to say exactly to what extent. And the Revolutionary Guard is also politically influential. Again, the economic sphere and the political sphere are interwoven to some extent. And that again invites also in Iran corruption and bad, I would say, economic management. Look at Turkey. The military in Turkey also have their economic interests, running factories, having majority shares here and there, but politically speaking, they have been sidelined. So the economic sphere and the political sphere are not intertwined in the same way. And corruption in Turkey is certainly at a lower level than in the other two countries I mentioned. And Turkey has had, that's a bigger story, Turkey has had high economic growth for a number of years. And then finally the upside, Tunisia, where the military have no economic interests to defend. They are apolitical. When Ben Ali asked the army to shoot at the demonstrators, the army said no, and Ben Ali hastily fled to Saudi Arabia. The manuscript, you may note, was finalized in May-June, so it misses the counter-revolution in Egypt and the election of Hassan Rouhani in Iran. So I wrote an epilogue to account for those events. But none of them, I would claim, and that is always important, indeed necessary, to understand subsequent developments. I would say the same for the other chapters as well. On the oil dimension, the Syrian conflict and the Iranian nuclear program, they have been deliberately designed as backgrounders to whatever that may follow. The optimism of the Arab Spring inspired new thinking about cooperative schemes in the region, and the book reflects on such lines of thought and such ambitions. For instance, by pooling the human resources of Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen with the capital resources of the Gulf countries, the region might get a big economic boost. Optimism, there was optimism also in the first half of the 1990s in connection with the Oslo agreements. Shimon Peres wrote a book about the new Middle East, where he presented a vision of porous borders and cooperation with Jordan and Egypt, predicated on a settlement of the conflict over Palestine and of Israel identifying as belonging to the Middle East, not simply as an outpost of the West. For the time being, such visions are off the screen, left by the wayside. There is more conflict than cooperation. So it is only fair to ask, has the Arab Spring been buried by the counter-revolution in Egypt and by the civil war in Syria with its many ramifications? Answering that question, I would recall that temporary returns to the old order is well known, both from the Middle East and from Europe. In the Middle East, Turkey has a long experience with such restorations. The latest being the military coup in 1997, when Erbakan and his welfare party was ousted. The welfare party resembling, by the way, in many respects, the Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt. But the Islamists reformed themselves, became more moderate. They redefined their loyalty to Islam as a commitment to universal norms and respect for all lifestyles, which greatly facilitated Erdogan's advent to power, democratic advent, and the promotion of democratic practice in that country. In Europe, think about Cromwell's British Republic, overturned, and we got the Stuart dynasty back on the throne, the restoration, before democratic practice slowly matured. And in France with the French Revolution, first Napoleon, but then the old dynasty, and there was a second republic in 1948. We have to expect moves back and forth, also in the Middle East in the time ahead. The Arab Spring certainly proved vulnerable to setbacks, but it left seeds of democratic practice and civil rights, which cannot be erased and which will influence developments in the years to come. Ever so often, pessimists are proven right on the Middle East. I would say pessimism is the mainstream thinking, and therefore we chose that cover that I just pointed to, the dark clouds, but also spots of blue, and I would like to end on such a note, a blue note. In Syria, with the Russian-American cooperation, there seems to be an ambition by these two powers to carry the cooperation beyond simply controlling and eliminating chemical weapons. Next objective might be a ceasefire. And I would emphasize they are probably strongly motivated, both of them, to carry this as far as possible. Obama is motivated for domestic reasons. Needless to the further this cooperation goes, the more pride they can take for the progress. So there may be a breakthrough. It is tempting to say, in the line of pessimism, mainstream thinking, that yes, there are 1,000 details in and the devil in 1,000 details from the rudimentary agreement that was struck in Geneva and to the goal of getting rid of all chemical weapons, not to speak of higher ambitions than this. But there is also the possibility that this might turn out in a more positive direction. And I would link that also to developments in Iran to achieve political solutions in Syria necessitates Iranian involvement. And there's a new president, Hassan Rouhani, who has struck a conciliatory note in relation to the regional arch enemy, Saudi Arabia. He says this is one of his top priorities. And the conciliatory note direction west, United States, and to Europe. It seems to me that, and I stand corrected, Kayhan is going to speak in a while, it seems to me that he is keeping the doors to government offices in Tehran closed, very much closed. And I take that, I read that as a positive sign. Because if I read the signs correctly, there is silent diplomacy going on at the highest levels between Tehran and Washington. When I read Bob Iman, who just left the administration, saying that he would recommend, he would hope for bilateral talks between the United States and Tehran, that is just another sign. And to protect themselves from disturbances, it makes sense to keep what I believe is going on as close to the rest as possible. There is the possibility that things may swing back in a positive direction for cooperation in the Middle East. So let me end on a reference to the German philosopher Hegel, known for his dialectics. It has many interpretations. But so he has been saying that in all social processes there are contradictory elements, and it is the tensions and the conflict between those elements which create the dynamics of developments, and hence a phenomenon may swing back into its negation. The pendulum may swing. And then you all know that in addition to thesis and antithesis, he also said a lot about synthesis. But that philosophy may be, I shed some light also on developments in the East. Let me just finish by introducing the three international guests that will have the floor throughout the day. Kayhan Barzegar is director of the Institute for Middle East Strategic Studies in Tehran. He's been a research fellow at the Welfare Center of the Kennedy School, Harvard Kennedy School. He's a research associate at the MIT, and he is the editor-in-chief of Discourse and Iranian English Quarterly. Kayhan, maybe you stand up and be seen.
Yes. Thank you. Hello, good morning, everyone.
Thank you. Lüders from Germany has studied Orientalism, political science, and economics in Berlin, and Arab literature in Damascus. He has been a Middle East correspondent of Zeit, works as a regular commentator for German and Swiss media, and is an advisor to the German Foreign Ministry. And then, good, thank you. And then Jean-Francois industries in the Gulf and their importance in world trade. But not only that, to me, Jean-Francois always left the impression of being Seznec unlimited. I'm very grateful to you, not only for your contribution to the book, but also for all kind assistance that you rendered throughout this project to make it a success. Thank you very much. You are most welcome to make comments on whatever I've been saying this morning, but hold it till later on in the day. You will have ample opportunities in the course of today's discussions. I would now like right away to give the floor to Kayhan Barzegar to present your view of the Arab revolutions and to brief us on Iranian foreign policies after the election of Hassan Rouhani. Kayhan, it's good to have you here. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lodgaard, for inviting me to this wonderful event. I'm glad to be here to share with you some of my views as an Iranian academic. This is my third visit of Oslo. The more I come to this great city, the more I like this town, and I'm grateful for you for this invitation. I would like to mention a few points about the book itself, and then about the elections and foreign policy of Dr. Rouhani in Tehran. About the book, I have 3 points. My first point is about the greatness of this book is because of Dr. Lodgaard himself. I think he kindly accepted that we somehow center the main theme of the book on regional approach. I think under his leadership, we could manage to produce this wonderful book, which is focused on regional views. And I think he moderated the book chapters very well on the course of different roundtables, because it's very difficult to bring different experts from the region that are related to their past ideology, values, and different geopolitical characteristics. I myself from Iran have a different view of Iran's geopolitics and Iran's foreign policy. It's absolutely different from a Turkish view. From my point of view, Iran's active presence is something that has roots in Iran's history. But from a Turkish view, Turkish government presence in the region is not something that perhaps Turkish people would want. Therefore, bringing different views was rather difficult. And I think Dr. Lodgaard moderated the expert group very well so that we could manage to bring up a theme that could be manageable on some kind of regional approach to solve regional issues. This is something that, in my belief, is an achievement in this book. Again, I think every state in the Middle East is influenced by its past geopolitics, history, identity, and this was something very difficult we could manage. Therefore, this is one thing. I think, unlike the prevailing view that regional issues should be solved with international actors or outside actors, this book is focusing its energy to how bring up regional actors so that they can cooperate to solve regional issues. Of course, this doesn't mean that we are going to not involving outside players like the EU or the United States or other countries like Russia or China. But this regional approach that the Lodgaard mentioned is something, a combination of cooperation between regional countries plus cooperation with outside actors. This is a new theme that I think it was developed in this timely book about the Arab Spring. So this was how they have reacted to the Arab Spring. Here I mentioned that how Iran and Saudi Arabia central geopolitics somehow attaches themselves with their geopolitical interests, and at the same time with their values and identity, so that they can connect themselves with regional elements like Hezbollah, Hamas, and other regional factions in the region. Turkey is a different player because Turkish foreign policy is somehow influenced by different historical facts. Egypt is influenced by its war with Israel and past defeat in the war with Israel, and the issue that how is affecting Turkish Egyptian domestic politics, youth, and the history of the past is somehow influencing the different actors' foreign policy in the region. Again, I mentioned that it is a tradition in Iran's foreign policy to have an active presence in regional issues for the sake of preservation of its geopolitical interest. And I think this was very difficult to have different experts from the region to work together and to kind of coming to a main theme, which is somehow regional approach for solving regional issues. So this is my first point, thanks to Dr. Lodgaard. My second point, which again I mentioned in my chapter, and I somehow stressed on the whole two roundtables in different occasions, was the fact that the Arab Spring is not just the developments happened in the domestic politics. It's about foreign policy as well. Arab Spring, of course, it is about ideology, Islamic ideology. It is about withdrawing from authoritarianism. It's about the middle class rights. It's about the market economy, everything. Women's rights, domestic politics. And at the same time that sometimes we ignore, the Arab Spring is about foreign policy themes as well. And that is for having active foreign policy, having independent views in conducting foreign policy, national security issues. So for the first time, we mentioned in the book and developed that we see two levels of politics in the Arab Spring developments. The domestic politics and the role of media and public opinion is influencing the foreign policy of the states. And that was something we mentioned in the book, and I think it was something that somehow is evident in the different chapters that the authors wrote in this book. So we see somehow how domestic politics is influencing the foreign policy of the states. And that has had a tremendous impact on Iran's foreign policy. And that is that Iran, a country that traditionally wanted to relate itself with ideological and valued factions and movements like Hezbollah and Hamas, now is dealing with new states that are going to be friendly, like Egyptian state. Now we see a turn, a shift in Iran's regional policy. Two themes are effective here. One, how Iran's to continue its traditional relations with traditional factions like Hezbollah and Hamas, so that it can preserve its ideological or Islamic Republic's ideals on the one hand, and on the other, how to manage to develop new relations with new states. Like Iran was the target of Egyptian Mubarak's regime for many years. I'm sure you're familiar with this idea of Shiite geopolitics, in which Iran was introduced as the main threats in the region by bringing up or creating a bloc that is called the Shiite Crescent, starting from Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and ending in the south part of Saudi Arabia. But this is not an Iranian theme. The Iranian foreign policy has always tried to focus on Islamic unity. From a realistic point of view, this is the right policy, because if Iran focused, would do. Therefore, this is not an Iranian theme. The issue that Egypt's Mubarak for many years introduced Iran as the main sense of Shiite geopolitics is no longer now in Egyptian foreign policy. So in that term, the Arab Spring has somehow brought up a kind of opportunity for Iran. And Iran's new approach is a struggle to how manage to establish good relations with New Egypt. Now that there is no such a thing in Egyptian foreign policy or Egyptian-Iran relations, now the new generations of elites in Egypt would think that bringing up such a concept is unnecessary, it's not good for regional cooperation. So we see how Iran has had this struggle to balance between its traditional relations with traditional ideological factions like Hezbollah and Hamas, which was related to Iran's Islamic Republic's ideals, and at the same time establishing new relations with states. And this is something new. So I would say that these developments in the Arab Spring's foreign policy concept has shifted Iran's foreign policy towards a new kind of regionalism. In this kind of new regionalism, Iran is trying to balance between these two concepts. And this was the main theme in my chapter, try somehow to show that how this balance is happening in Iran's regional policy. And my third point, and I finish, is about Iran's dealing with these developments. Well, as I mentioned, Iran is a different country in terms of its geographical centrality, connection with different subsystems, South Asia, Central Asia and the Caucasus, Arab Levant region, the Persian Gulf region. So different subsystem gives Iran this thought that Iran at the same time needs to balance its relations with this centrality in the greater Middle East. This is somehow influencing Iran's foreign policy. In terms of dealing with the Arab Spring, I would say that Iran's policy has been different from state to state, and it is wrong to think that it should be similar Iran's foreign policy in dealing with Egyptian developments compared with the Syrian developments or Bahraini developments. I would say Bahrain is in the center of the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf is considered Iran's somehow domestic security. Any instability in Persian Gulf will endanger Iran's national interest. Therefore, Iran has been very cautious to react in Bahraini crisis. Here, Iran has been soft and tried to somehow put the issue in a political context. When it goes to Egypt, as I mentioned, it is important for Iran to establish a new kind of relations with Egypt. So Iran would like to have good relations with Egypt. Doesn't matter it's President Morsi or it is the new government. Iran's thought is that it is an opportunity for Iran to have close relations with Egypt. Not only it is in Iran's foreign policy in the time of the Islamic Republic, it was the policy of the Shah of Iran, the ex-regime of Iran, because it's considered that Egypt is the most important and influential country in the Arab world. The more Iran has established good relations with Egypt, the more Iran will be eased in dealing with regional issues in the Middle East. So Egypt is the focus of Iran's Arab world policy somehow. Now we see that Iran's reaction to Egyptian developments is in between, not taking the side of Morsi's regime, not taking the side of the coup happening in Egypt, because at either way, Iran would like to have good relations. It is afraid to lose this opportunity that Mubarak's regime for long introduced Iran as the main sense of threat in the entire Middle East politics. I don't know how much Iran's going to be successful in this policy, but this is Iran's geopolitical interest in establishing good relations with Egypt. So we see that Iran's reactions in Egypt is not that much, easy with this kind of conceptualization, because I think if we put this kind of resistance, moderations, or reconciliation block, that means Iran is put at the top of the back concept here. That's why I put it in the regional context. What is Iran is supporting in Syria is the fact that Iran would like to preserve the concept of a state in Syria. Any extremism in Syria that nowadays we see, for three reasons, is not good for Iran. First of all, in the Arab world, if you have a kind of extremist trend, that will immediately turn to anti-Iranians, like in Iraq, like other countries. So Sunni extremism will be anti-Iran at the first level. The second is extremism will bring foreign forces again to the region, like attacking Syria. Iran is happy that the United States is leaving Iraq and Afghanistan in 2014, not because of these countries, situation, because of the fact that from an Iranian perspective, it is a constant in Iran's foreign policy that foreign forces will be a threat for Iran when they are stationed in Iran's neighborhood. Not because of threatening Iran as a country or threatening the government of Iran, the Islamic Republic, because of the fact that foreign forces will minimize Iran's regional role, and it was something that has been Iran's foreign policy. And third point, that extremism will bring up civil war in the region. And civil war is extremely dangerous in an already volatile Middle East. I don't know if you thought about the fact that if these extremist trends come to power in Syria, they are monopolized, they are ideological, they would like to hold the whole power. The example of Afghanistan and the Taliban is a good example for us. It is rather naive to think that Taliban can be integrated in Afghanistan coalitional government, because the Taliban is monopolized. They would like to hold the whole power. If they come to power, the civil war is inevitable. If in Syria the opposition forces by military force take Damascus, you should forget about any kind of coalitional government in Syria. That's the experience Iran has in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't know how this win-win situation will go, but at the end of the day, it should be a kind of political solution for Syria. Any military solution will bring up civil war and extremism, which is extremely dangerous, not only for Iran, but for the United States, Europe, and every country. The loser of Arab Spring developments are all countries if it is turning to civil war and extremism. And we see this kind of extremism is coming up. Therefore, in Syria, Iran's policy has been different. I would say that even in the time of Dr. Rouhani, this policy would go ahead, because by that, Iran has a clear aim in saying that political solutions is the only solution that is coming from the region. But the Arab Spring, let me finish by focus on the opportunity and also the challenge of Arab Spring for Iran. Opportunity I mentioned that Iran can play its role in a constructive way in Syria, establishing good relations with Egypt and other Arab countries who for many years considered Iran as the main ideological threat. Unnecessary tensions between regional actors. Like the Iran-Iraq war, in my belief, it was very unnecessary for different reasons. There was no need that regional countries do not cooperate. I think the Arab Spring brought up this theme that we need to withdraw from this concept of internationalization of the Middle East issues, turning it to the regionalization of the Middle Eastern issues, so that we give more hand to regional actors in cooperation with outside actors to work together to solve the regional issues. The traditional view is that the foreign actors should have the final say, like what it was said by Condoleezza Rice in Washington op-ed, that we should come and take the final say and intervene in this. Now the role of masses in influencing the foreign policy of the states matter a lot. So no longer we can focus on the role of outsiders. It should be the role of both outsiders and insiders, considering the political security realities of the region. For instance, in Egypt, I would say that a new kind of nationalist or liberal are coming to power, like Musa al-Bradi and others, who belong to the past, but now because they need to take the votes of the masses, they need to distance from the United States somehow. The new generation would like to have good relations with Iran because they don't see Iran as a threat. Rather, they see Iran as an opportunity. They might not like to strengthen relations with Iran, which is fine. But if they stay in the traditional theme of anti-Iranianism, this will empty their hands in conducting or balancing their regional relations somehow. So we see a new kind of generations coming to power in Egypt. Or another trend is ideological Muslim brotherhood. It is wrong to consider they are not part of the society. They are part of half of the society. They cannot be ignored. So this new generation of elites are taking root in Egypt as well. That shows that Egyptian foreign policy is influenced by these kind of generation of elites or old elites that are reforming themselves in a new situation, and that will bring up a new kind of relations between Iran and other countries. But at the same time, the Arab Spring, to be fair, has brought up a kind of challenge for Iran, and that challenge is related to the regional rivalries, I would say, between Iran and Turkey. Iran and Turkey, before Arab Spring, had very good relations. Now they don't have a good relations. Iran, Saudi Arabia know how to deal with each other for decades. Now they have tension on Syria. Iran and new government in Egypt, of course, they have this thought that closening relations with Iran will somehow endanger their other regional issues, like relations with Qatar, relations with Saudi Arabia, or even relations with Turkey, but at the same time, they think that how to balance the relations between Iran on one hand and the other regional countries and outsiders by the other. So this is a challenge for Iran, and Iran needs to somehow adapt itself with new situation, and that is the theme I mentioned in one of my op-ed. That is, Iran needs to shift towards a kind of regionalism in which the proper relations with the states in its proper way should be addressed, coming out of its traditional view of developing relations with resistant movements only. Iran needs, for the first time, to address the both sides relations. And that both side relations is somehow to answer the question of how to manage relations with new states that I mentioned again. So these were my 3 points in my chapter. We discussed on these in the book, and I again say that Dr. Lodgaard was very successful to moderate different views. We're coming from different countries with different backgrounds, with different views about how to conduct foreign policy, different ideological, identical characteristics, but Dr. Lodgaard was successful to moderate us so that focusing on the main theme of the book, which was how we can conduct regional approach to solve regional issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kayhan. After what you said about the relations between Iran and Egypt, I would turn your attention to Nabi Fahmi's chapter in the book. A solid part of it is precisely about these relations as seen from Egypt. And I would say what you have been presenting today and what he writes in the book makes a good match. Thank you very much once again. I would now call on Frida Nome to moderate the Q&A following this.
Thank you so much for a very interesting.
I have first an observation for the introduction. I don't understand when we say moderate Islamist. I think this is the wrong perception. There is a moderate Muslim, but there is no moderate Islamist. When you are Islamist, you are a sort of fundamentalist, and in this case, it won't match. When we apply your theory regarding Iran, if I remember well, after the ousted of Morsi, the Iranian reaction was not positive, in spite of the fact that Morsi, with his policy regarding Syria, for the first time Egypt had cut a relation with an Arab country in its history. It was with Syria. And what happened also, for the first time in Egypt, there were attacks against Shia. I remember very well, 4 Shia were killed in Egypt for the first time in the history. Attacked in a house in a remote area outside of Cairo. And the reaction of Iran were not really very, how we say, it was very moderate to what happened, with also the attacks against Shia, I don't know how we can call it, shrines inside Egypt. There were many. So I don't know how it fit your view and this new pragmatic way of the Iranian external policy. Thank you.
So we could take the second question, Are. Could you please also introduce yourself when you get the word?
Hello, I'm Are Lodgaard from Landinfo, Country of Origin Information Center in Norway. Thank you very much for a very interesting introduction. As an academic living in Tehran and studying the Arab Spring, I would be very interested in hearing your views about what impact the Arab Spring had on Iranian internal politics. We know all, we remember the Green Movement after the elections in 2009. Some of the leaders wanted to celebrate the Arab Spring, the freedom of the people in other countries in the region, and they are still in house arrest. Karoubi and Saleh. So could you explain what sort of impact did the Arab Spring have on freedom of assembly, freedom of speech in Iran? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think the questions are very good, and I try to answer. The first question about moderate Islam, or there is no difference between these two. It depends where you would like to put it. Some countries, some governments try to somehow combine these two, but some countries, because of their backgrounds and different views of Islam, would not like to put it in that direction. But I don't know if you put it in a precise way, the moderate Islam in Egypt or Iran, I can perhaps explain more. But somehow, I might agree with you. There are this kind of definition, and we should be careful of the differences between different terminology here. Regarding Iran's reactions to Shiite massacre, again, I think, as I mentioned, Iran wanted to stay in between and try to not somehow its role to be perceived as a response to the Egyptian coup d'etat was very careful and cautious. I'll tell you about the Iranian media inside the country. Some of them criticized the government for not reacting in a solid way. Some of them said it was okay. This is an internal issue. Some intellectuals and academics say that this is the continuation of democratization in Egypt. Different views like any other country. I'm trying to say that Iran is not an exception in showing its foreign policy. It has some goals, it has some principles and constants that are being influenced by its geopolitics, history, and ideological ideals. But this has been somehow, in a way, a tradition that when Iran is saying something, for instance, about Iraq's domestic politics or Yemeni's domestic politics or Syrian domestic politics, that is perceived as an intervention. But when it goes to other countries saying everything, no one is, or less people are playing for that. I'm saying that Iran is a country that is also confused by the Arab Spring developments, is trying to adapt itself to the situation somehow. Sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful. But this is the story of a state trying to adapt itself with the situation. It's like America. American is also somehow, the American government is confused, staying between preserving its geopolitical traditional view of preserving stability in the region or letting the new voices of democratization taking roots in the regional issues. I'm afraid to say that the Americans have decided to take the first one, like their reactions to the recent Egyptian Morsi's outsetting from the government. So they thought that staying on the track of preserving stability will better serve their national and security interests. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have roots in American foreign policy or Middle East policy. Promoting democratization is there, but it doesn't have the power to shape the policy of a state in the region. Iran is also, like other countries, trying to balance its different views from different background and characteristics. Third question is about the impacts of the Arab Spring on Iran's domestic politics. I would say that it had. For instance, Iranian intellectual and academics, students' reactions to Iran's support of the Syrian government. Somehow, it is now in that way as it was at the beginning. At the beginning, the media started to say that the Syrian Bashar al-Assad government must take some reforms and changes, or even he must leave the government. But now it's turning differently, because when it is related to preserving Iran's geopolitical interest, foreign forces coming, or a battle for filling the vacuum of power in the region, now the Iranians are thinking that the government's policy in Syria has a different realistic influence or realistic approach that favors Iran right now. With these chemical weapons used there, again the necessity of Iran's playing a constructive role in Syria is coming up in the Iranian media. But again, I'm not saying that the Iranian domestic politics are not influenced by the Arab Spring development. They are influenced by the others, but there is one difference here. And that difference is that the Arab Spring development was about democratizations and these kind of things. And these are not that much new for Iranians, because the first constitutional revolution happened in Iran 100 years ago in 1906. I'm not saying the Iran's democratization process has been good, but it has its own way. And the Iranians are battling to find their own way of leveling their democratization process. It's not that much good, but it's better from many other countries in the region. So I would say that it is not new to just focusing on authoritarian regime or voting parliamentarians and other things. These are not new, and Iranians have been coming from different backgrounds. Of course, political reform is something that that movement wanted, but it's not all. So we should not put it in the same category, I would say. That might be different in a way, but I agree that it is influenced by the Arab Spring that we can see.
We have more questions. Please, Dr. Abil.
Abil Basini from the Egyptian Embassy. Thank you for this launching of this important book and for all the contributions. And I'd like to add some comments and one question. So my first comment is about as Professor Lodgaard introduced, this book ended by May 2013, so it doesn't include the revolution of the 30th of June and afterwards. So and this is and the contributor here, the main contributor from Egypt is a foreign minister now. So it's really unusual to say counter-revolution on a participant who is an official now. So this is my first comment. Revolution is a revolution. It cannot be counter or reverse or any. It's as we agreed, there is now a new political actor in the region, which is the people. So we have to respect the will of the people, and this is a new factor in the region. As we all agree, it hasn't been taken into consideration before. So I can accept it as a popular coup or a democratic coup, but not a military coup, because it wasn't by all the definition like this. My second comment is that if we are talking about regional things, we also should, as you implied, some definition has to be clarified. So if we are talking about regional issues, so is it Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf, or at least we will agree on some definition of the Gulf. This is why I don't agree with you when you are talking about Shia Crescent was an Egyptian fear. It wasn't like this at all. Egypt was the most moderate country with Shia, and they have no problem so ever in at a sectarian level in this before Morsi's rule. After Morsi's rule, and it goes with all, as you said, if there is an extreme Muslims groups are there, this raises issues with other sectors. So it needs some also deliberation and some work on some definition between us in the region. Okay, so my media here play a lot of role, and we all witnessed the playing of the media when even the deposal President Morsi was in Iran, and some words about Syria has been changed to be I mean, implying different things about Bahrain while it's not the real situation. So media has to be taken into consideration here also. Because truth. My question is about the nuclear file. Nuclear file, it's something important in the regional discussion, and you haven't mentioned it. So how it is affect the relation?
Should we take one more question?
Yes,
Please.
My name is Tom Rond. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. You mentioned the roles the internal and external actors have to play and the cooperation between them. What is your view on the role which international organizations such as the UN, the EU and the Arab League could play? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, especially the comments from friends from Egypt. Reacting to Egyptian development is not something that I should say. I'm only an academic from Iran. When it is a coup d'etat or it is a democratic movement is something that Egyptians themselves should deal with that. I think the Iranian government tried to stay in between, not intervening in such a situation. I can say my comment about President Morsi's dealing with domestic or regional policy. I think in domestic politics, President Morsi acted very fast. He should have tried to balance different forces, different political forces inside Egyptian domestic politics, because the Egyptian revolutions is something that is happening in the process. He shouldn't have gone that far, tried to isolate other forces. In my belief, he acted very fast because perhaps he was afraid of losing the ground. Because the Muslim Brotherhood came to power after 80 years. It was a long way waiting for power. He tried to institutionalize its role and place in the domestic politics of Egypt, but it lost at the same time. It was very costly for it. This is my comment. I think President Morsi has acted fast, but I think it was a coup d'etat anyway. How could you just remove a government that has been elected by the people? So this is something that will come back, but it is not my role to explain it as an Iranian academic. But I can tell you one thing about President Morsi's regional policy. I think he could withdraw Egypt from the traditional way of considering Egypt in the context of the Arab world politics, bringing up two other players, Turkey and Iran, putting in the broader regional cooperation matter. This might have not been liked by some Egyptian forces, I know, but President Morsi bypassed the foreign ministry traditional way, tried to bring up this new theme. I think that merited to be considered in a proper way. That's something that connects to my main theme of regionalism. Egypt must be involved in regional cooperation. Without Egypt, nothing is going to happen. And without Iran, is nothing going to happen in Syria. How could Iran be isolated from the Syrian crisis when it has the most active regional role? It is very naive to think that Iran will let other players play their role in Syria. So I think that merited to be considered in that way. But again, I'm only an Iranian academic, let me stay out of it about the Egyptian domestic politics. You mentioned about Iran, terminology. That is true. I think terminology is coming from the different historical background and geopolitical centrality. For Iranians who would like to focus on Islamic ideals of the Islamic revolutions, the Arab Spring is called Islamic awakening. The Saudi is calling this Arab Spring as Arab awakening because they would like to focus on the conservative part of it. The Turks would like because they It is the advantage of the Turks to put it in the Turkish soft power. They put it Arab Spring because they think that they can get the market economy and other things. Soft power, Islamic model, something. Others are saying the ocean. Or we go and say the Persian Canal instead of Suez Canal, something. Historical names are there, and we cannot just change it. But again, it's a sensitive historical matter, and we cannot just put it like this way. But foreign policy is more flexible, and we can change it according to the historical realities and different characteristics of a nation here. You mentioned about Shiite geopolitics. I don't think this is the wish of the Egyptian nation. It was a policy of the ousted regime of Egypt. President Mubarak mentioned very precisely that the Shiite of the region are more loyal to Iran's government than their own government, somehow. That triggered the whole idea of Shiite geopolitics. Of course, it was mentioned by King Abdullah in 2004, but somehow it evolved in the Egyptians' politics, Egyptians' foreign policy, because Egypt naturally considered itself as the head of the Arab world politics, play this leadership role in terms of ideological matters. I think that's why I'm saying that it's very good that Egypt is coming out of this ideological, unnecessary kind of sensitive issues, trying to put it in a normal way. I am in favor of somehow constructive, even somehow competed way of cooperation between Iran and Egypt, but not in an ideological way. Egypt has some interest in the Persian Gulf, that's correct. The Egyptian government is saying the Persian Gulf security is our own security, that's fine. But while Iran is saying that the Syrian security is our own security, or Iraqi security is our own security, or Iraqis are saying Iran's security is our own security. So I mean, coming back to the region, I'm not trying to support the policy of the government of Iran, I'm only academic. But again, I think there should be some support of historical facts, trying to affair.
From Iran, and recent events in Egypt haven't been all that pleasant, unfortunately. Let us go back a little bit in contemporary history. As you know, 2.5 years ago, the Egyptians got rid of their long-time 30-year dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak. And of course, this was the second country in the Arab world after Tunisia that was successful in a popular uprising against the regime, against a regime that had failed to give any leadership to solve the burning issues of the time, that is mainly to develop the country, to push ahead with economic reforms, and to broaden the democratic basis of the given political system. It is well known that also the young generation did, of course, play a major role in this confrontation with the Mubarak regime, and in the end, remember these pictures, Mubarak was toppled. That's the good news. And now comes the bad news. Of course, Egypt is not only a country with an army. We could say, we talk about an army that controls a state. The Egyptian army is the most powerful actor within Egyptian society and has been so since 1952, when a coup d'etat of Gamal Abdel Nasser brought Egypt independence from Great Britain. And ever since, the army has played a very strong role in Egyptian society. And this role has not only been strong in political terms, but also in economic terms, especially after the signing of the peace treaty with Israel in 1979. After this peace deal with Israel, there was a problem what to do with all these generals, with all these would-be heroes that suddenly were not needed any longer. And the idea that the Egyptian government had at that time, that Sadat favored, was really to open up economy towards investments by the army. And not only that, many leading generals that retired, who were forced to retire, were given lucrative jobs in the business sphere. Unfortunately, many of them had no idea whatsoever how to manage a factory, but it wasn't important because the idea was not that they be effective in their role, but they were given a privileged position in order to be loyal to the government. So what they did was not really develop their country, but to use state funds in order to enhance their personal richnesses. And at the same time, we saw an ever-growing involvement in intertangling of the political sphere and the economic sphere. So the absurd situation, if you wish, was that after signing a peace treaty with Israel, the military became even more powerful than it had already been due to the new economic drive that the generals were able to use. And it is very difficult to say how much of the Egyptian economy is being controlled by the army today. There are no official figures. It's a state secret how much money the Egyptian companies that are run by the Generality make every year. But the estimates range from 10 to 40% of the Egyptian economy that is controlled by the Egyptian army. Now, what does this mean? It means, for instance, that there are corporations in Egypt, large corporations in the sphere of the real estate, in the sphere of developing the tourism industry, in factories when it comes to car making, when it comes to producing milk, whatever you can imagine. In most leading companies of Egypt, you will see a strong hand of the army, a strong hand of the generals in these in this economic system. The economy in Egypt is split. We have a private sector and we have a state sector. And the state sector is very much run in a way that reminds us of former Eastern European economies. They are not so much out for really being profitable businesses, but they are out to please, to feed rather, a certain elite of society. And the entanglement of politics and the military, also through intermarriage, has led to an almost unprecedented influx of state money and people in the top, in the higher echelons of the hierarchy, not the everyday soldier. And the mentality of these military elite is not necessarily one of wanting to develop Egypt. It is rather one to help yourself and take and grab as much money as you can. The Egyptian military does not pay taxes. The Egyptian military does not account for its economic endeavors whatsoever. They simply cash in and they do whatever they please, and they invest their money abroad. They are not really interested in developing the infrastructure of the Egyptian economy. Should you have been to Egypt, should you have ever taken a ride on the Egyptian train, you know what I'm talking about. The infrastructure is decades old, and nobody really sees any necessity in developing this infrastructure. So Mubarak was toppled, but the army continued to be the strong player in the background. And this revolution, if you want to call it that way, it did not have the intention to topple the military, and it would not have been possible to do so. The military is the only institution in Egypt that holds this country together. And for reasons that are not always rational, many Egyptians think that the military is a neutral actor and an actor that is interested in developing the country, that it holds the honor of the Egyptian people, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of wishful thinking involved. I mean, historically speaking, as I mentioned, the Egyptian military has never been on the side of the people, has never enhanced democracy, it has only enhanced its personal egoistic interests. And it's, if you wish, a certain tribal mentality, an elite mentality, not a mentality of saying, well, we are one country with 90 million people, and we need to develop this country because there are so many young people who need jobs. People don't seem to care about this. So we had this toppling of Mubarak, and of course Mubarak was himself a general, and many generals in leading position of the Egyptian army should have been thankful to Mr. Mubarak because it was he who gave him their positions. But of course, in a situation as we had seen it in Egypt, this revolution, these hundred thousands of people on the streets, so the army had to give, some sacrifice in order to survive itself. And the sacrifice that was being done was that the army toppled Mubarak, and he was then, imprisoned, all this, and was put on trial. But this was really a royal sacrifice, so to speak. The army did that because the army wanted to continue holding its privileges, and it wanted, of course, to avoid a civil war. Theoretically, the army could have used violence to crush the revolt, but there were too many people on the street, and it didn't appear appropriate for the army to go against its own people. So Mubarak was toppled, and then there was a political void. As you remember, it took 1 year until elections took place in Egypt, and in the first year of this interim period, it was the army who pulled the strings. It was the army that was in command of the Egyptian political system, and the main character of their policymaking was really repression. Thousands of people were arrested because they continued to demonstrate on the Tahrir Square in Egypt, and put into prison on the grounds that they had insulted the army and that they had not acted appropriately. It was General Sisi, who is now the strongman in Egypt, who introduced these virginity tests for women who continued to protest on the Tahrir Square. And the Egyptian army did everything to crush this revolt because it wanted stability. And during the first year of the military being in power, it threw away, one may say, almost 1/3 of the financial reserves of the Egyptian central bank in order to pay for the subventions of food, mainly bread, in order to please the people. But the army had no theory whatsoever, no idea what to do with the country as a whole. I mean, there was a transitional period, but they had no political concept as to what to do with this country. Then came the elections, and the big winner of these elections were the Muslim Brothers. You remember that during the revolution, the Muslim Brothers did not really play a leading role. They were the last, so it's really not a surprise. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood, as you recall, was founded in 1928, and it is the only political force that we might consider to be a grassroots movement in Egyptian society. The Muslim Brothers are popular, or have been popular, not necessarily because of their ideology, but because of the fact that they take care of social services. The Egyptian state, as all the other states in the Arab world, don't care about social welfare, about helping people in need, and it was the Muslim Brotherhood that filled this gap. So people in need, that didn't have enough money, that were unemployed, widows, poor people, they could be sure that they received a certain amount of support in even form of cheap bread by the Muslim Brotherhood, and this made them very popular. In ideological terms, the Muslim Brotherhood, historically speaking, had two approaches to society, so to speak. One was to oppose a political system that was seen as unjust, and the second approach was to oppose any foreign involvement into regional and domestic political issues. In 1928, it was, of course, the Americans that were the British, who were the most dominating foreign force, and after the Second World War became the Americans. The Muslim Brotherhood has changed its political policies several times during the long period of its existence. It became violent in the 1950s, 1960s for a certain period of time, but then with the era especially of Sadat, the Muslim Brotherhood became more and more a state-like actor. It was a little bit absurd. Officially, the Muslim Brotherhood was forbidden in Egypt, but in reality, it was, even under Mubarak, one of the strongest political forces. Sometimes it was allowed to be in parliament on the basis of independent delegates, sometimes it wasn't. But the Muslim Brotherhood was always there as a political factor that influenced politics in Egypt. Now, after the revolution, the secular, the liberal parties, whatever we want to call them, they were not able to organize themselves. there was a big political void after the toppling of Mubarak. I mean, all these regimes that had been in power, not only in Egypt for decades, did of course not allow for any civil society to evolve. And there was this huge void. And the secular and the liberal forces, mainly in the large cities, especially in Cairo, did not really understand the game of policy making. The main thing they were interested in, the liberal and secular leaders, was to form a party with them as the new Pasha, as the new Bey. They wanted to be the new boss. Most of these liberal and secular parties did not care about the poor in Egypt. They cared about themselves and about their own elitist interests, but they did not really reach out to the whole population, which is one of the reasons why the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, became the strongest force, politically speaking. I mean, imagine you live in a country that is in turmoil, nothing is clear, nobody knows what the next years will hold, and then what do you take? What do you vote for? You take a party that offers a certain identity, a certain amount of hope, a certain direction, etc., etc. But of course, the world of the rural poor differs very much from the world of the liberal intellectuals in Egypt. You are, of course, aware that Egypt is a poor country, 90 million residents. It's always difficult to argue with statistics when it comes to Egypt because there are no clear statistics, but I think it is not an exaggeration to say that around 40 million Egyptians out of these 90 million are illiterates, or at least half illiterates. And it is about the same amount of people who are very poor and who live beyond or just on the verge of the poverty line of $2 a day. In other words, we have a huge reservoir of people, millions of people, who try to survive on a daily basis, who try to survive to make a living for themselves and for their family. And it is not really possible in Egyptian society, even if you are very good in what you are doing, to move upward the social ladder. It's really, when we look at the social structures in Egypt, not only in Egypt, but in the Arab world as a whole, it's a social pyramid. And if you happen to be born in the wrong part of this pyramid, which is the lower part, then bad luck for you. You will have a hard time to really move upwards the social scale. So the Muslim Brotherhood, if you wish, is the expression of the hope of those who have nothing to lose. The Muslim Brotherhood is not only an ideological movement, but it is also an origin a little bit unclear. Mainly, I mean, generally speaking, we are talking about an elderly leadership, elderly man, 70 years old, sometimes older, and the outside world, even Egyptians, did not know who exactly is in charge of the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, as an underground organization, half illegal, you have to be careful. You cannot be open-minded and open-hearted and organize public discussions. You will be arrested. So therefore, they have a certain, tendency not to go public with their opinions. Suddenly, they were the strongest political force in Egyptian society, and it was a little bit too much for them, I would say. They were not able to shift. They continued to make politics on the basis of we might almost say, conspirational level. And it was very difficult for the outside world to realize what exactly they stand for, what do they want. The Egyptian Brotherhood has committed many mistakes, but in a certain way they are also adherent to the tradition. When we look at policy making, not only at party politics, not only in Egypt, but also abroad, you will not find many parties that are really interested in developing a concept for the whole country and to push the country ahead as a whole. Most parties are simply, if I may put it that way, associations of local elites, of group interests, and once a certain group comes into power, it will do everything it can to promote the interests of its own group, but it will not really cater for the other groups in society. And should criticism for these policies become too loud, these groups will be suppressed. The Muslim Brothers did the same thing. Once they were in power, they also tried to be influential in the sense that they wanted to be part of the economic game. And that was, so to speak, their first kiss of death. The Muslim Brothers have done many mistakes. First of all, they were not able to really define what exactly are the needs for Egypt. And the primary need for Egypt is to develop the economy. The economy after revolution was on the brink of collapse and is still collapsing. But the Egyptian Brotherhood did not realize that, that it's the economy that matters. They rather tried to make sure that their own people get into leading position of society. In other words, they did the same as the Mubarak regime before them had done, and all other regimes in the Arab world have the tendency to do. And this was bad. This was bad because the Muslim Brotherhood, they have a certain lifestyle, a certain approach to life that is not shared by those who do not believe in an Islamic lifestyle. I mean, the liberal and the secular people, especially in Cairo and in the larger cities, very much disliked the Muslim Brotherhoods because of their cultural approach, if you wish. They don't like to mix Islam and politics, Islam and lifestyle, etc. And the big mistake of Mr. Morsi was that he did not reach out to the opposition. Of course, he had the majority, and as a majority, having the majority, you can form your own government as you please. But the problems of Egypt are so huge, are so immense, that it would have been much more clever for him to introduce non-Muslim actors into the political game in order not to burden responsibility for themselves only, but to share responsibility for the others. The Muslim Brothers proved incapable of doing so. And that was really the second big mistake they did, that they had a very absurd way of approaching politics, very hush-hush-like, no public discussions on major issues, and at the same time trying to grab all the power they could. Again, this is something that's quite normal for the political game in the Arab world, but under the difficult circumstances in Egypt, it was the wrong approach. And it invited the opposition to criticize the Muslim Brotherhood in the way they acted. And of course, many people who had supported the Muslim Brotherhood in the beginning realized that they are not able to solve the economic problems. And when you look at policy making, at politics in the Arab world, people are not elected because they are nice people, because they have a nice party with a nice ideology. People expect the party to deliver. The National Democratic Party under Mubarak, they of course invested lots of money into those regions where they had the absolute majority. Make clear to everyone else, if you don't vote for us, tough luck for you. This system was not changed by the Muslim Brotherhood, and people were disappointed by them. Their expectations were too stronger and stronger due to the economy spiraling downwards and the many mistakes the Muslim Brotherhood did in policy making. The popular narrative goes that due to the mass protests that took place in Cairo and elsewhere against the Muslim Brotherhood, the army then stepped in as an expression of the will of the people to do away with the Muslim Brotherhood and thus to save democracy. This is, in short, the general narrative that is being used by those who are pleased with the military coup that took place on July the 3rd. But this narrative is, of course, a very short-sighted one. This is not really the case. I mean, first of all, the Egyptian army has never cared about democracy in that country, and the army did not intervene because they wanted to take sides for the liberal camp, but they intervened because it suited their business interests. The Muslim Brotherhood, among the many mistakes they did, was also that they made it clear to the military, okay, we will not affect their business life. We are not interested in we will not try to grab money from you. You can do your own business, but we also want to be able to have a say in the economic sphere of the country, especially when it comes to the public sector. This was very much disliked by the old Mubarak elite and by the military. Let us not forget that this revolution, if we want to call it this way, had toppled Mubarak, but the old gang, so to speak, the old elite of business people that had been put into power under Mubarak, and we are talking about some hundred families here, not more. These people were still there in the economy and also in the public administration, especially in the Justice Department, that did everything it possibly could to hamper the development of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was them who dissolved the parliament in 2012 in order to make it clear to the Muslim Brotherhood, don't you even dare to do anything against the old alliance of economy and politics through the old Mubarak camp. In other words, this revolution is an unfinished revolution because the old elites have not really been replaced, especially in the economic field. The leading businessman in Egypt, the most well-known abroad, is Mr. Zawahiri, who is a Coptic businessman, multi-billionaire, investing everywhere in Egypt and outside Egypt. He's now developing a huge tourist resort in Switzerland. So he's one of the top investors in Egypt. He has always been strictly against the Muslim Brotherhood, although the Muslim Brothers did not challenge the richness of these business people. But still, these rich business people disliked the Muslim Brotherhood very much because from their point of view, these Muslim Brotherhood people, they were just some stupid people from the village who happened to be in power, but the political culture of the two sides did not mix. It is very different to see this relationship between business people and politics in Egypt when you compare it, for instance, to Turkey. I mean, the ground of the leading AK party in Turkey is really the business elite from Anatolia, from the eastern part of the country. You have a second business elite that had developed in Turkey over the past 20, 30 years, parallel to the old Kemalist elite that is based in Istanbul. And this, these two business elites, until today, they don't really intermingle with each other in Turkey. They dislike each other. They have a different approach towards life and towards economy and towards the way they wish the country to be governed. In Egypt, we don't have a business elite that is closely aligned to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is, if you wish, an organization that mainly takes care of the interests of poor Egyptians, but the old business and political elite does not want these poor Egyptians to, become too influential in society. And they dislike the idea of these people whom they do not take seriously, that they have a say in politics. Now then came the coup d'etat, and I think, first of all, it's interesting to note that there was so much reservation in Western countries to call a coup d'etat, because, as I mentioned, the official narrative, it has nothing to do with the reality. It was a coup d'etat, of course it was. I mean, it was a government that was elected by the people, and it was kicked out of office for whatever reason, but it was not really the way one should do politics. What happened after this coup was quite amazing. Amazing in the sense that suddenly the Muslim Brotherhood did not only become the arch enemy of the putschists, of those who were responsible for the coup d'etat. There was also, a huge wave, tidal wave, if you wish, of even former supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood who suddenly found that this Muslim Brotherhood was really the incarnation of evil as such. I mean, when you hear liberal Muslims and liberal Egyptians, when you hear them talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, it sometimes reminds you of, I don't know, I don't want to make wrong comparisons, but it's very amazing, this hatred and this being against them. There are 1,000 good reasons to be against the Muslim Brotherhood. If I were Egyptian, I wouldn't vote for them. That's one thing, you can't be against them. But this hatred that turns against the Muslim Brothers, people in Egypt almost clapped when more than 1,000 people from the Muslim Brotherhood were killed by the army and said, it's great, yeah, it's good, finally let's get rid of them. Le Monde, the French newspaper, published an interview last month with the leading General Amr, and he was asked about the Muslim Brotherhood and his approach to them. And he said in this interview, well, we are 90 million people in Egypt. 3 million, he said, according to him, 3 million people actively support the Muslim Brotherhood. And we as an Egyptian society, we can do without these 3 million. And then the journalist asked, what do you mean? And he said, well, you can do anything with them. Imprison them, kill them, whatever. You don't need these 3 million. So in other words, this is really very difficult to understand for a Westerner to see this approach again, there's plenty of reasons to be critical about the Muslim Brotherhood. But this hatred of the so-called liberal elite, of the so-called liberals in Egypt against the Muslim Brotherhood is very irrational, and it is dangerous because it carries the seeds of a civil war. Civil war in the sense that if you deny the fact that 50% of the Egyptians had voted for the Muslim Brotherhood, of course a liberal Egyptian will immediately say, oh, it wasn't 50% because half of the people didn't go vote. But still, I mean, who cares? I mean, there were elections, they were the strongest party. I think for the development of Egyptian democracy, it would have been better to leave them into power and to vote them out of power. Because this would have given the possibility also to the Muslim Brotherhood to develop internally. They were not ripe, if I may say so, for taking power yet. But the military is not an alternative. Liberal, or so-called liberal Egyptians, they think that these generals do their business and take care of democracy because they only arrest Muslim brothers. But this is only the beginning. They will not stop arresting Muslim brothers. They have arrested secular liberal Egyptians for a year after the coup d'etat, after the toppling of Mubarak, and they start doing the same thing now. This is just the beginning. And I'm very much amazed about the reactions of liberal Egyptians about this hatred towards the Muslim Brotherhood. This is very irrational and, as I mentioned, very dangerous. Now, what is going to happen in Egypt? First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood is forbidden, as you know. I mean, most of us haven't really noticed that the Egyptian government, the interim government, which is nothing more than decades of General Sisi, this interim government has forbidden the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization 2 weeks ago. We haven't really noticed that because our interest was focused on Syria. But the Muslim Brotherhood are now an illegal organization in Egypt. Now they are used to that, being illegal, being underground. Their leadership is completely, has been thrown into jail. And the legal accusations against this leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood is nothing but ridiculous. I mean, imagine that Morsi is being accused, whether you like him or not, but he's being accused of being a spy for Hamas. The Muslim Brotherhoods they are accused of being responsible for the deaths during the toppling of the regime of Hosni Mubarak, as if it had been the Muslim Brothers who shot the demonstrators. It's really absurd. It has nothing to do with state of law. This is making a case against your enemy in order to crush his enemy. The Muslim Brotherhood will probably be split. The moderate leadership will try. And I am very much afraid that we will see a development in Egypt that reminds us very much of Algeria in the 1990s. That means we have already seen in the past 2-3 weeks many explosions, many attacks on Egyptian police stations, and lots of violence in the country. This is the beginning. And they are still amateurish in their way that they attack policemen, but they will become more professional. I think it's only a question of time until the first bombs will explode on a marketplace in Cairo. Of course, from the military point of view, this is great because then we'll have another pretext to go violently against the Muslim Brotherhood. The army and the official media in Egypt, they like to present the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. They make no distinction whatsoever between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat al-Islamiyya or some other radical groups that exist in Egypt, mainly on the Sinai. They make no distinction whatsoever. And of course, this discourse that is being used in Egypt against the Muslim Brotherhood by the liberals is a discourse that leads directly into civil war, into violence, into a deterioration of the already difficult state of the economy. Let us not forget that the tourism sector is one of the most important economic sectors in Egypt, and this tourism sector is on the verge of collapsing. The German government has issued a travel warning. That means that for Egypt, and that means that now German tourism company is allowed to send tourists any longer to Egypt. I mean, they can do so, but should something happen, then they carry the responsibility. So in other words, this tourism industry will collapse, is on the verge of collapsing, and that means that 10,000s of Egyptians will become unemployed, which will add to the already strained situation. I think, and I want to finish here, what strikes me most, and this is something that I would like to discuss with you, is this really irrational approach of hatred towards the other. I have had many discussions with Egyptians in Germany. I mean, Egyptians who have lived in Germany for years, not to say decades, who have a German passport, who speak perfect German. But you can talk talk about anything with them, and he will have very differentiated points of views from them. But when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, it's like the Nazis. Excuse me, yeah. It's like the Nazis talking about the Jews. Yeah? I mean, there is a complete lack of rationality in their approach to the Muslim Brothers. I wonder. I'm not sure about my theory, but I sometimes wonder when we look at party politics in the Arab world. These parties are mainly organizations of certain groups. You can say of clans, of tribal affiliations, religious or ethnic affiliations. And I sometimes have the impression that a party that cannot deliver, for whatever reason, is then demonized. And the same happened with the National Democratic Party after Mubarak was toppled. The very same party that had good relations with the people. At the time Mubarak was in power, everybody tried to be very polite to the NDP people, but immediately after he was toppled, their offices were torched. And now the Muslim Brotherhood is making the same experience. Well, last thing I want to mention, of course, these developments in Egypt also have consequences for the immediate neighborhood. As you know, the relationship between Hamas and the Gaza Strip and the Muslim Brothers were very good. Now the Egyptian government is doing everything it can to hamper the Palestinian economy. Most of the tunnels, smuggled tunnels between the Gaza Strip and Egypt have been closed. And this will, of course, create many problems with the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and will fuel tensions. And I don't think that the Egyptian army will be able to really crush militancy in the Sinai Peninsula. Of course, the military is also accusing the Muslim Brotherhood to be responsible for these tensions in the Sinai Peninsula. But as you know, the main reason for this violence that we see in the Sinai Peninsula is the result of the neglect by the central government under Mubarak over decades. And one of the results of this neglect was this coming into being of violent gangs who abuse Islam for their own interests. So we have a very uncomfortable situation in Egypt, and unfortunately there's very little we can do about it as Europeans, even if the Europeans and the Americans should stop, which I would strongly suggest, all military cooperation with the Egyptian government, not development aid, that is very much needed, but to stop the military cooperation, even if the Western countries did that, the Gulf states would be more than happy to fill in the gap immediately. And the government of Mr. Sisi has just received billions of dollars in aid by Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, not by Qatar, because Qatar had supported no readiness by moderate, liberal, so-called liberal Egyptians to really take an analytical approach towards the problem of the Muslim Brotherhood, but I rather see an exclusivist approach. They are our enemies. We should hit them wherever we can. But these so-called liberals simply underestimate that they will be the next target should they dare to criticize General Sisi, who might, by the way, stand for elections in January or February, whenever these elections take place. He's still not sure whether he wants to become the next president, but he would like to, because he thinks of himself as a very brilliant man. But for Egypt, it spells trouble. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a very strong and thought-provocative introduction. I'm sure we will have plenty of comments and also questions. So I welcome you to ask questions, but also would like to remind you to introduce yourselves. So please, we have the Egyptian Embassy, Dr. Amir, who would like to respond to this.
Thank you very much for your presentation. First of all, I'm just having a point of order here because I thought this is about the book which doesn't include the revolution of the 30th of June, but it's welcome to discuss and to let the people and the public knows about the situation after the 30th of June. But I have to say lots of misleading information has been given today. And let's begin with from the end. If you accuse Egypt about, putting a siege or hurting the Palestinian people, this is totally a wrong narrative. Stop smuggling. This is a legal issue, and it's a request from the international community of all. Gaza is sieged by Israelis. It's not sieged by or harmed by the Egyptian. So how you? It's really wrong and unlegal point of view to say that stopping smuggling goods and armies from Egyptian side without paying taxes or something. Trade should be legal. It's Israeli who are combating and sieging Gaza. Let's not forget this situation. So if something, we all support the Palestinian people to have their goods, but the one who you should find is the Israeli siege, not there is no Egyptian siege. It's just controlling the border. Okay, so and there is lots of information. I cannot count it, but for example, if you are calling it the government of Sisi, it's not the government of Sisi. This is a civilian government, interim civilian government. It's not like when 2011 revolution happened, when there was a military council, CAF, which was governing Egypt. This is a civilian government with lots of caliber people. Some of them was one of your colleagues who wrote the book, who is Mr. Nabil Fahmy, who participated in this book, and all the figures from this civilian interim government are well-known figures, and they will not be a marionette in the hand of any military government. They are civilian ones. And the conclusion, the problem is that it's like the Egyptian, it's like the Arabic-Israeli conflict. Two parties have to want to have a peace. If the two parties doesn't want to have the peace, it cannot happen. The same is now. It's the Muslim Brothers and some of the Islamic streams like Jama'a Islamiyya does not want to participate in this roadmap for democracy. So we cannot oblige them or push them to do something that they don't want. Of course, violence doesn't pave the way to make this conciliation, but the violence is from their part. And here there is another problem. If you are accusing the Egyptian media to be misleading, this is contrary wrong. The Western media is the one that misleading information. Like lots of Muslim brother has been detained. No, there hasn't been, and there has been no political court. All of this, all of what happened, and by figures, I can tell you there has been 5,000. Order to detain, but not all of them has been happened, and all of it are for criminal accuses with the order of general prosecutor. And if you accuse the judicial,
Excuse me, Abid, we have to make it a bit. Could you
I
round
will
up because we have
summarize.
other questions also? Thank you.
The judicial, I just wanted to, because in the comment there has been a comment about judicial autonomous or judicial, if they are part of the system or the Mubarak regime system. Every institution was part of the system, okay? So there is some, reforms, but it doesn't mean this is who dissolved the parliament. This was dissolved according to problems in the elections, and it has been announced. But anyway, I will sum up by saying that I have lots of things.
We can continue also over lunch, I'm sure.
Problems happen when, in the beginning, there was a misleading information about Egypt. As you said, Egypt is a poor country, so why it's a middle-income country according to the United Nations? Okay,
Thank you.
since the 80s.
Thank you. We have,
Wrong narrative leads to wrong conclusion, and this is to summary up the whole thing.
Thank you very much. It's a very polarized. It's become a very polarized conflict, and it's obvious strong opinions about this. We have a question or a comment in the back. Yes.
Margrethe Austno. I'm working with asylum seekers and the refugees in Norway, and I have two questions. One is the situation in Sinai and the groups there. How would you describe them, and the state's role in trying to curb them or not trying to curb what's going on with kidnapping of refugees and hostage taking in the Sinai? And then the role of Qatar, how they are playing a role in many of the conflicts in the area and supporting radical Islamist groups. Is this as challenging of the Saudi position, and how would you say they play their role, and what's the reasoning? Thank you.
Maybe one more.
Okay, there's one more question here.
Of February. And really, you have a great knowledge of Egypt. I don't doubt. But by the way, you made a mistake. It is not Zawahiri, it's Sawiras. And also, my question is about, you said, I'm quoting you, when you talked about the Muslim Brotherhood, they became a state-like actor during Sadat. I was, by the way, in the 70s in university. I remember very well, one day we were attacked. It was not only one, the first one. We were attacked by the Muslim Brotherhood and other groups which were supported by Sadat because it was a way to, how we can call, to get rid of the communists and the Nasserists inside the university. You talked about the Muslim Brotherhood, that they got to violence during the 50s. Let me correct you also, it was from the 40s, not from the 50s. And the 30s, okay? So, what I missed also in your presentation, you mentioned it at the end, that there is many Islamist groups inside Egypt. It is not only the Muslim Brotherhood, which are the Salafists. There are many groups, Jama'ah Islamiyya and others. And certainly the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Islamist scope of is very large, very wide. Even the Muslim Brotherhood, they are not the main actor in Upper Egypt. It's more the Salafists than the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know if you agree with this or not. So, accusing also the, how we can call it, the liberals of Egypt, that they are against the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know if I can consider myself as a liberal or not, but anyway, it doesn't matter. We have a problem that with the Muslim Brotherhood, we had a constitution, a religious constitution. Sudden, from 1971, a constitution which we don't accept it, to a religious state, in spite of the fact that Mr. Morsi himself promised that the state will remain a civil state, a civilian state, not a religious one. So I would like your comments about this.
Okay, let me start from the end. You are absolutely right in reminding us that especially Sadat used the Muslim Brothers and even more radical Muslim Islamic groups in Egypt as a counterbalance of the influence of Nasser's forces in Egypt. This is well known, and in the end he paid the price himself because he was murdered by someone who came from the Jamaat Islamiyya. And out of this Jamaat Islamiyya, let us not forget, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the boss of Al-Qaeda now, comes from Egypt, and he is part of this radical Islam that originates in Egypt. Do Muslim Brotherhood activists have a problem with violence, with using violence in the public sphere? I would think so. But I think we cannot look at these things without, at the same time, looking at the fact that the state, the government, has always used violence to crush anyone that the state disagrees with. And we have seen it in July when more than 1,000 people were killed by the army in order to simply dissolve the demonstrations that happened against this coup d'etat of Mr. Morsi. So there is a culture of violence, not only in Egypt, but in the Arab world as a whole. The idea that this mentality leads nowhere, because no side in Egypt can win this confrontation by violent means. The army is not able to crush the fact that half of the population feels close to the thinking of the Muslim Brotherhood, as incomplete as this thinking and as incomplete as their actions may be. And you are right in pointing out that the way that the constitution was pushed through by the Muslim Brotherhood, that was one of the many mistakes they did. They shouldn't have done it that way. But we should never forget that the Muslim Brotherhood, even during this 1 year of their reign, never had full control, had the power in Egypt. Yeah? It has always been the army, even before the coup d'etat. I'll give you one example. In February, it was, Mohammed Morsi visited Berlin. And before his visit, his state visit to Germany, the foreign ministry received several calls by leading members of the army, including General Sisi. And these generals told the German government not to receive Mohammed Morsi on a state visit to Berlin. I mean, imagine this. Imagine this. In any other country on this world, this would consider to be high treason. Yeah? Sisi calling the German government, telling them, you should not talk to Mr. Morsi. It's absurd. I tell you this as an example that even at the height of their power in this short reign of 1 year, the Muslim Brotherhood was never in control of the country. It has always been the generals in the back. That's one thing. To the lady, just a short remark. I always admire the ability of representatives of official politics in the Arab world to look at reality in such a way that one thinks as a listener, wow, what kind of world is being described? It's interesting, the most interesting aspect of your elaborations to me was that I learned that there are no Muslim brothers that are in prison now. I mean, they seem to be just, somewhere in the desert, but not imprisoned. And it makes no sense to continue discussing on such a basis. We need to make sure that we discuss about the moon and not about Mars. And I think that, and this is really that worries me very much, this inability to analyze reality the way it is, but rather to project into reality on an ideological basis, that's the best ground for a civil war to emerge. And let me be very frank. If you want to see your country destroyed, it's your decision. It's your country. I would suggest that people talk to each other. There's no reason to like the Muslim Brotherhood, but there's also no reason to like General Sisi. And one narrative I found interesting was that you mentioned that the foreign media is distorting the image of Egypt abroad. That's a very familiar line of argument these days. Not only Western media are being accused of being pro-Islamist, pro-Morsi and other things, which is nonsense. Also, Al Jazeera is being accused of this. In the English channel of Al Jazeera, for instance, when you watch them, they still have correspondents in Egypt, but they are never shown, and they only talk on the phone, because, well, the 4 journalists of Al Jazeera English have already been arrested on the grounds that they are making propaganda for Morsi. This very much, I mean, I come from Germany, and this reminds me very much of the way that the former East German government handled their view on world politics. It was always, Western media, Western conspirators who are responsible for the many things that went wrong in East Germany. But in the end, there is at least two camps in Egypt, political camps, and of course one can negate the reality of the other side. One can claim that it's all an act of conspiracy, that foreign powers are behind this, and it's always easy to make Israel responsible for anything that goes wrong. By the way, among the many things that Mohammed Morsi, the also president, is accused of, also belongs at this point, he is supposed to have spied for the Hamas movement in the Gaza Strip, which is one of the, I mean, it's obviously so absurd that it's not really necessary to comment on it. I mean, it simply tells you the question of the lady about violence in the Sinai. That is a very unfortunate and sad and tragic development. The main reason of the Sinai, of this violence that we see there, mainly in the northern part of the Sinai, is that this region has been completely neglected over decades. Although, starting in the early 80s, the Sinai was really very profitable due to tourism that was developed especially in the south. And but the Bedouins on this Sinai Peninsula did not really profit from this. And the northern Sinai became a lawless area. It's not under control of the Egyptian government any longer. Also, it was difficult for the Egyptian army to move against that part of Egypt because due to the peace treaty with Israel, the Egyptians cannot do whatever they want in military terms, but the Israelis have given the Egyptians green light to crush the revolt that we see there. This is not an organized revolt. It's not about politics. It's really, I would say, political and criminal gangs intermingling. And they are very much into the kidnapping business, as you have mentioned. There are thousands of people from Black Africa who try to flee to Israel for a better life, and they have to go to the Sinai. And many of them are being abducted, are being abused, are being raped, are being tortured, whatever you want. And they have to pay ransom, and they are lucky if they survive. There is very little one can do against this. I mean, the Egyptian government is not able to do so, neither this one nor the one before it. So this is what happens when a country neglects a certain region of its country for whatever reason, and then you cannot get these things under control anymore, and the situation will become even worse. There's plenty of weapons pouring into Egypt from Libya. So expect more of this type of violence, not only on the Sinai Peninsula, but also in the south of the country, south of Egypt. And now you asked about Qatar and Saudi politics. I make it very short. Qatar had tried to.
It is time to resume, and we have come to the last leg of the seminar. We are going to listen to Jean-Francois Seznec talking about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, their attitudes and policies towards the developments in Syria. Jean-Francois, it's a pleasure to call you.
Thank you very much. Of course, this is a very difficult topic, as we all know today, since everything is changing by the day, by the minute even. So please have mercy on us and mercy on me, in the sense that what I'm going to say may or may not be valid in another half an hour. But I wanted to really discuss a little more what I think the point of view of the Gulf countries. My specialty is really the Gulf countries on the, I would say, on the Arabian Gulf side of the Persian Gulf, the Saudi Arabia in particular, and some of the events that have taken place relative to the Arab Spring in the UAE and so on. But just a few notes on I think, the Saudi Arabian view of Egypt and the Egypt revolutions is that the Saudis really, at least as far as I can tell, are extremely happy with the events in Egypt and the takeover by the military. There has been some talks in Washington, and since I am from Washington, of course I carry these thoughts with me all the time. There has been some efforts in the U.S. to punish Egypt and the military for removing this whole idea of democracy in Egypt. I think no one Washington is fooled by the fact that it was a military coup. It's very difficult for the Americans to call it, for the government to call it a coup, because if it is called a coup, by law, they have to suspend the foreign aid. And the foreign aid meaning the $1.4 billion that go to the military every year. So we, from Washington, we don't have a coup. We have an evolution of the situation, or whatever we call it, but it's not a coup. But of course, it is a coup. And the Saudis have already told everyone that not only if the US cuts the money, they will pay the difference, and they will add up another $10 billion. We have $12 billion of Saudi commitment on this. But one thing that was very interesting in terms of the relationship between the Saudis and the Brotherhood, and I will perhaps be slightly different than Michael Lüders on that, is that the Saudis have a very, in my view, a very mixed approach to the Brotherhood. Today, they don't like the Brotherhood, but let's not forget that in the 50s, they were the haven for the Brotherhood. When Nasser started oppressing the brothers and killing them, nothing new under the world, they went to Saudi Arabia. And not only did they go to Saudi Arabia, but they made an alliance with the Wahhabis. And that allowed them basically control of society in Saudi Arabia. The arrangement between the Wahhabis, the conservative Wahhabis, and the brothers was to create this sahwa, this reawakening of society, which gave them basically, and that was really King Faisal's doing in many ways, he gave them the education system. And the educational system in Saudi Arabia has been controlled to this day by the sahwa, which is the brothers. And the Wahhabi, and we're already on the second generation of these people. So the brothers from Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, even when Morsi took over, had a certain following in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi state, the Saudi government may not like them entirely, but they didn't totally distrust them either, because there is so much influence of the Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia to this day, today. So at the time when Morsi took over and was elected, the Saudis didn't like him, but they still gave him $5 billion. And that really made a big difference at the time for Morsi. So today the situation, of course, the Saudis like to have the military back in power, to have Mubarak without Mubarak, But today has been slightly different from the past in the sense that the Brotherhood today are really, they view it as a hegemonic movement. They see the Brotherhood as trying to take over the whole region under the Brotherhood, and that they really didn't. In other words, they see very little difference between the Nasserites of the 50s and the Brotherhood of today. And both of them had to be destroyed. And that's what the UAE has been doing. The UAE in particular in the 50s and 60s was very threatened by Nasser and the Nasserites at the time. And they really gave them a hard time at the time. And today they're doing the same thing with the brothers. So Qatar is a very interesting situation in that sense, because yes, Qatar had been supporting the Ikhwans. We all know that Qaradawi has been one of the prime person on Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera in the region is very much viewed as the image or the public spoke group for the Ikhwans, and that is probably true. But Qatar today is very silent about what's happening in the region. And I think Qatar all of a sudden realized that the Saudis and the UAE was very strongly opposed to the Ikhwans, and that both of these countries and Kuwait were supporting the military. So let's remember that Qatar is a very, very, very small country. It only has 200,000, 250,000 citizens. So for Qatar to poke its finger in the eye of the Saudis too much is dangerous. And I think Qatar feels more threatened by Iran than they do by the Ikhwan. So at that point, if they have to make a choice, they probably have decided to work with the Saudis. They may not give a lot of money to the new Egypt, but they will not do anything against it either. And I think the support of the Ikhwans in Qatar is going to wane very rapidly if it hasn't waned already. Qatar needs to establish itself for the future. This whole idea of Qatar having gone to great extent to get the 2020 or whatever World Cup, which is going to cost them a mere $40 billion or whatever, may sound a bit ridiculous in some ways, but it's very important for Qatar because it's a means for them to exploit, to show their independence in the world and their importance to the world. If the Saudis and the UAE want to create trouble, Qatar could not really hold these 2020 events easily. So I think the choice for Qatar is to work with the GCC, therefore with the present system in Egypt, and forget about the Ikhwan. And I'm not sure why there was a change in leadership in Qatar a couple months, 4 or 5 months ago, 3 months ago. But the emir has changed, but more important, the prime minister and minister of foreign affairs, the same person, has been removed. And he was the one who was probably the most likely to support the Ikhwan. So anyway, this has changed. And I mentioned the UAE was very, very strongly opposed to the Ikhwan, more so than ever, to the point where anybody suspected of being friendly to the Ikhwan in the UAE is being arrested. And many of them have been denationalized. Their citizenship has been taken away from them. And that's really very, very difficult. It's hard for us to understand how that can be done, but it can be done. And they've done the same thing in Bahrain with the people there. Syria, there's no secret, of course, that the Saudis are extremely opposed to the Assad regime. But this is a relatively new thing. The King Abdullah, when he was in charge, before he was king, was in charge of the Syrian policy. And at the time, he had married one of Assad's very cousins. And he was really very close to Assad and to the Syrian regime. The Saudis were working very well with the Assad regime. However, for one reason or another, the Assad regime is accused by the Saudis of having blocked. Rafik Hariri was Saudi citizen. He had been brought in to Lebanon to bring peace to Lebanon by the Saudis. That was the Taif Accord and so on. By killing Rafik Hariri, Assad declared war on Saudi Arabia, in essence. And that was really the start of the downfall of the relationship. The Saudis are also viscerally hurt by the killing of Sunnis. I think this whole sectarian divide has been exaggerated, and as somebody mentioned, is used by each side to, to talk to their base. But it is very, very easy for the more conservative and for most of the Saudis to push this fact that the Sunnis are being killed by the Alawis in Syria. And that is really very hard for them to accept. And Saudi Arabia sees very much Syria as the linchpin of the arc of Shiism, which Kayhan mentioned earlier, which was invented by, by King Abdullah of Jordan in 2004. Right? And but Syria is really, as far as they're concerned, the link between Hezbollah, Iraq, and Iran, because the Saudis view Iraq as really controlled by Iran, and they view Syria as controlled by Iran, and therefore Hezbollah as controlled by Iran, and basically blocking the Sunni, the arc of Sunnism between Turkey and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and now Egypt. So what we're seeing here is the proxy war between Syria, the arc of Sunnism, if you like, and the arc of Shiism. And I think the Saudis are very much pushing for the fall of Assad in this way. However, the Saudis are really caught in a bind because, okay, they really want the fall of Assad today, but they do not want Assad to be replaced by Al-Qaeda. Many people will tell you in Saudi Arabia and in Washington as well that the American intervention in Iraq really has given Iraq to Iran, which I'm sure the Iraqis do not necessarily agree with, but that's the view of many people. And the worst thing that could happen is for an intervention in Syria to actually bring the Sunnis to power, who then have a very strong chance of being taken over by the more extreme group, by Al-Qaeda, and therefore to hand Syria to Al-Qaeda. So the US would have been very lucky into giving Iraq to Iran and Syria to Al-Qaeda, which is not exactly major victories for the US policies, if that were the case. But the Saudis are aware of that very much, and they do not really want these extremists to win either. So there's not, since they cannot help their brothers in Syria, they cannot help the Islamists, and they don't want Assad, there's really not much to work with as far as they're concerned. So I'm not very sure how this will develop. Let me perhaps talk a little, since I sort of have to do that, talk a little bit about the US policy in Syria, or like Iraq. But just for the record, I think we can say that the US population is totally opposed to an intervention in Syria. And when I said the population, 60% of the last poll, 60% of the population in the US was against an intervention in Syria, of whatever form, not just Tomahawk missiles or a clean intervention. They were opposed to it. The funny thing is, Congress is also opposed to it, by and large. And perhaps more surprising, the Pentagon, the military establishment, is very strongly opposed to an intervention in Syria. And in spite of the speeches over the last 2 weeks by President Obama, I'm personally convinced that President Obama is totally opposed to an intervention in Syria as well. So we have sort of a confluence of feelings here against an intervention in Syria. The funny thing is that the liberals in the US the churches, and all these groups are opposed to the intervention in Syria because they're against war. So it would have to be a fairly powerful strike. But once you start putting your finger in the vice, you're stuck. And they've been through this before. You know, the Pentagon has been through this. They've been through this in Iraq. They've been through this in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, we have the Pentagon being in charge of regime change. And that is really not something they want to get involved in. And to put it in a very human way is these guys who made the decisions, and I've talked to them in the last month or so at length, is, you know, they're really worried about their guys coming back dead. And, you know, even if it's only 100 or 200 people dying, it's very important for the US military. And they're not going to let, I mean, they're fighting it as much as they can. Although they're the military, they're given the orders, they'll do it. But they're not, they're really arguing very strongly against it. So just since I think the president is against this as well, I think there's a little bit of a charade going on, where I think the president is really saying we've got to attack, I have to have the right to attack Syria militarily, and that is giving him some credibility with the hawks, you know, like McCain, Senator McCain, and the people of this nature. So this way, he looks like he's being a warmonger with Israel. That appeals to a lot of people, that appeals to the Israeli lobby, and that gives him some backing on his being strong. On the other side, he makes the deal with the Russians, because then that gives him credibility with his own wing, with his own left wing. The left wing of the Democratic Party will say, and it's not really the left wing, the center and the left wing of the Democratic Party will say, we elected you, we gave you a lot of money to stop the war in Iraq, to get out of Afghanistan, to stop this whole concept that the United States must be the policeman of the world. And there's a very large segment of the population today in the US who really strongly believes that the US can no longer be the policeman of the world. Now, whether they're successful or not, I cannot tell you, but this is a growing voice. And it's a growing voice, interestingly enough, it's not the left. It's the left, it's the center of the Democratic Party, and it's the right of the Democratic Party. The Tea Party and these people do not want to be involved overseas. They see that it's costing too much. We really have to take care of our own problems at home. And so I think we're witnessing a very big change. And Sverre this morning mentioned about the US losing influence in the Gulf. Yes, and that is very much increasing because a lot of within the United States, there's very much of an effort now not an effort, but a feeling in the population that this is time we stop being the sort of the police people in the world. And so we'll see how that goes. So the interesting thing is that this argument, today there is no argument in the US on punishing Syria from a purely US interest point of view. The president does not use the whole concept of punishing Syria because Syria having nuclear weapons is really a danger to the United States security. They don't make the argument at all. The argument now is on the basis of morality. We have to punish Syria for using a weapon of mass destruction. Just like we would have to punish Iran for building a bomb. Well, we don't know whether Iran is building a bomb. We don't know, we're not really 100% sure. We think we are sure that the Assad regime actually used the chemical weapons. But of course the Russians are hinting that in fact it is the rebels. Well, they're not hinting, they're saying it was the rebels who used the weapons. So we don't really know. There's this sort of vague notion that it will be from any side. But the concept today, the only argument that is being pushed by the states is we have to show that it is against human nature and the interest of humanity to punish a state that uses weapons. This has provided a great opening for Russia, of course, to start re-entering the Middle East a little bit and to start re-entering the diplomatic world and showing that they are absolutely indispensable. And yes, they are indispensable. It is also interesting to see that Iran is beginning to see that itself, as Kayhan mentioned, that it should not be forgotten in all this. It is important to have Iran in the negotiations, because if it is true that Iran is very close to Assad, which it is, then you cannot make peace without the Iranians. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, that really opens up the door for a major negotiation for the whole region, because if Iran, as President Rouhani said yesterday, I believe, is absolutely opposed to nuclear weapons, then the US has an opening to work with him on trying to bring back Iran into the world, the world of nations. So we'll see how this develops. I'm a little optimistic after what Dr. Lodgaard said this morning, that maybe we have a base for negotiation. It's not going to be easy, but I think within the US there is very much this feeling that yes, there is an opening and it could work, but it's not going to be, it's going to be very true. The Saudis view the US intervention or the change in the US mind as a little bit tricky. I think the Saudis would have liked very much to see a US intervention in Syria, because ultimately they themselves are involved. They want Assad to fall, and they would have liked to see the US do the dirty work for them. And I have argued in Washington that the Saudis, whom I greatly respect and like, but the Saudis were manipulating the United States to intervene. Because if the Saudis could get the US to bomb, to use some strong means to weaken Assad, well, if you weaken Assad, why do you weaken Assad? You weaken him because you want him to go away, and you want to have regime change. There's just, we're saying we're not, the president actually said he's against regime change per se, but if you're going to bomb them, that's what you want. There's just no way out of that. So I think the Saudis know that, and the Saudis were perfectly happy to see the US bomb Syria. And I believe the Turks also were quite happy to see the US do that. Now, as I said before, the US has no national interest in doing anything against Syria today. So it would really mean that we'd be doing it for somebody else. And then we'd be doing it for Saudi Arabia. It seems to me, however, that the Saudis, if it is true that they would be very much happy to see a US intervention in Syria, it's not really quite right, because the Saudis themselves have a very large military, or at least they should. They have spent hundreds of billions of dollars arming themselves, being trained by the US. The present chairman of the Chief of Staff in the United States, General Dempsey, actually trained the National Guard for 2 years in Riyadh. So there is a lot of links there, right? But the Saudis have a military. They have F-15s, they have AWACS, you know, the airplanes that can see which newspaper you're reading in Beirut when you're based from all the way from Yemen, you know. They have these airplanes that can refuel the big airplanes that can, they're refueling tanks, flying tanks, and they could really run or they should, let me rephrase this, they should be able to run a no-fly zone in Syria if they so wanted to do that. And so could the Turks. Now, why would they be doing that? Why would we in America have to do that for them? You know, it's just, they don't want to take the risk. They want us to take the risk. And therefore, I think the US is just feeling that perhaps it's time for the Saudis to do this kind of thing. Now you see, a lot of people will say in Washington, D.C. So what's happening today in Saudi Arabia in particular is that really nothing is happening. There are no decisions taken in terms of Syria, in terms of Iran and whatnot. And I think a lot of it is just on cruise control. They're just trying to see how things are going and pray for the best. One of the key problems they have in Saudi Arabia today is that the king, who is a great man, who is a forward thinker, who has worked really hard for the integration of all the sects of Islam and worked a lot with the Shia and so on, his first foreign trip was to Iran when he first became king. The king is very old and not able to have the leadership he used to have. And I think that's really the key issue. He's not able, if we're talking about issues of war and peace with countries like Syria, only the king can make the decision. And the king is really not in a position today where he can make that kind of decision. And the rest of the leadership in Saudi Arabia, let's say number 2, Prince Salman himself is ill and may not be able to make that kind of decisions. So until there is really a transfer of power to a slightly younger group in Saudi Arabia, we will have problems in making decisions. Now this is not all impossible because, as I said, the king is very old, he's 90 years old and whatnot. Prince Salman is not far from there, but he's also not too well. There's a number 3, Prince Mughrin, who became number 3 not that long ago, about a year ago, and who is a much younger man. He's only in his 70s, but he's a very strong man. He's very well liked by the people, and he's very much a product of King Abdullah. He's very close to Abdullah in terms of philosophy. And I think that would be very positive for the future of Saudi Arabia. And I think that may bring some changes. But the crisis is today, not tomorrow. So who's going to make the decision today? I don't really know. So the succession in Saudi Arabia is clear, but the problems, it will happen, and probably for the good. But we need changes today, not tomorrow. So I don't really know how this will evolve. But I think I'm hoping that the great powers of Syria and the United States can have some wisdom and move along the lines we discussed earlier. And perhaps that will avoid the worst. But in the meantime, I agree with Kayhan that the regionalization of the issue should happen, and that the great powers should try to remove themselves as much as possible from the region. And I was talking to a Chinese friend of mine, whom we all know, Bing Bing, who wrote a piece in the book, Mr. Dr. Wu from Peking University, and his comment, and I'll just close on that, is, if the United States attack Syria, we're very happy, because it means they will put their finger in the vice, they'll get back into another war in the Middle East, which means they will not reposition in the Far East. So, thank you.
Very well. Recalling the US interventions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the bombing of Libya, the failures
Which the French did.
which the French led, but still the US participated. And on top of that, the talk about bombing raids in Syria. I'm reminded of Einstein and his definition of the ultimate stupidity. He said the ultimate stupidity is to do the same thing many times over and expect different results each time. Questions to Jean-Francois? While waiting for you, I have one myself. Listening to what you said about Saudi Arabia and the Syrian landscape, not wanting by any means to liaise with Assad, but not being happy with the jihadist siding and not happy about the Muslim Brotherhood. And you said, what does that mean? What could it mean for Saudi attitudes towards what the Russians and the Americans have started? Could the Russians and the Americans begin to count on some sort of Saudi support for the political track?
Yeah, I think given the choices they have today, I think the Saudis will have very little choice at this point, but to go ahead and support or not interfere, let's put it this way, not interfere with the U.S. or Russian move to ban the weapons, the chemical weapons from Syria. I think they will work with that. I think what they would love to see is a situation where that can develop into bringing Iran and having Iran make a commitment not to have nuclear weapons. Now, Rouhani said that, President Rouhani said that, and they like that very much, I'm sure, because that is their whole problem with the Iranians today is their fear of the Iranian nuclear weapons. You cannot talk to any Saudi person without saying, oh, but we know the Iranians are building the bomb. Of course, no one really knows, but the Saudis are sure of that, and therefore all their decisions relative to Iran have to do with that. If there can be some controls on the nuclear effort in Iran, then the Saudis will support that and will really work very closely, I think, with the Rouhani to bring some kind of a settlement. I think the Saudi, one of the key to understanding, in my view, the Saudis today is to understand that Saudi Arabia views itself as an economic power. And they want to develop as one of the main economic powers in the 2020s. They're among the largest producers of chemicals in the world, they're among the largest producers of metals in the world, etc., fertilizers and so on. That's how they see their population evolving, is from an economic standpoint. They want to have economic power. If they have to keep spending their money on fighting wars or having problems with the Iranians, then it's not going to go anywhere. And they really want, I think the king, especially Abdullah, wanted to maximize this peace dividend or stability dividend. Stability is the key.
This is most interesting. Kayhan mentioned that Rouhani says he will go for more transparency in the nuclear program. The rumors are saying that Iran may also be willing to close down one of the enrichment facilities. And then I took particularly from the very beginning of Rouhani saying that relations with Saudi Arabia is a top priority. And that, of course, has a bearing on many relations, also on Iranian-Egyptian relations, because what is holding the Egyptians back today is presumably their dependence on Saudi money. But if relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran improves, the restraints of Egypt, Nabil Fahmy is writing intelligently about it in the book, the restraints on Egypt will also diminish, so the prospects for normalization will be better. I think that statement of Rouhani's, Saudi Arabia top priority, is a strategically very intelligent move.
Now, what we have to remember, though, is that this little ray of hope which you're bringing forth here is very fragile. Because on every party, there are groups that are really going to work very hard to destroy it. You'll have certain groups in the United States who will want to stop that. You'll have many groups in Israel who will want to stop that. You'll have the more extremist groups in Saudi Arabia, if they exist, who will want to stop that. You'll have more extreme groups in Iran trying to stop that. So, the enemies of the good are almost as powerful as the enemies of the friends of the bad, of the friends of the good. So I don't know where we're going to end up. It's just that it's a faint ray at this point, and we hope it stays that way. and expands.
Questions? Yeah.
No, just wanted to add that these regional crises issues are no willing to engage Iran in the Syrian crisis. Even Iran was, the Syrian crisis was somehow connected to a change of regime in Iran in that time, or weakening Iran's positions on its nuclear policy. Now, this is not somehow it's going to happen. Therefore, I think on the Iranian side, there is really this willingness to open up with all regional countries, not just Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia tops the issue because Dr. Rouhani would like to start its regional cooperation from Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is a key country. Of course, the two are rivals in different issues, but the two have learned to how control each other. Therefore, he said that he will start from Saudi Arabia because the tension on Syria is coming especially from Saudi Arabia. And then it shows that Saudi Arabia is key in solving the Syrian crisis. I would say that on the Iranian side, there is this willingness to go in that direction. I would say that Iran's domestic politics is somehow ready, different forces were somehow in favor of strong Iran's regional presence, are in favor of opening up with regional powers. So it was a comment just added to
Yeah, on the side I was sort of arguing here, I just hope that the Saudi leadership is able to answer positively on these matters, and because originally that's what they wanted. See, when the Saudis were ready, the Iranians were not ready. Now the Iranians are more ready. Are the Saudis going to be more ready? And I think a lot of people in Saudi are, but there are a lot of people who are not. And again, who is going to have the upper hand? We don't know. Hopefully,